The silence at Riverside County Shooting Range was deafening. 27 seasoned marksmen had just witnessed something impossible. A 17-year-old girl with a rifle she'd built in her garage had just shattered every record they thought was untouchable. But 6 hours earlier, those same men had been doubled over with laughter, pointing at what they called a toy gun made of spare parts. Sarah Chen stood at firing position 12, her shoulders squared, her breathing steady. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The rifle in her hands looked nothing like the pristine competition weapons surrounding her. Where others gleamed with factory polish and precision-milled components, hers was a patchwork of mismatched metal, repurposed parts, and what appeared to be duct tape. The stock was carved from reclaimed wood, the barrel showed signs of hand tooling, and the scope looked like it had been salvaged from a telescope. The head judge, Marcus Rodriguez, a 30-year veteran of competitive shooting, stared at his stopwatch in disbelief. The numbers didn't lie, but they defied everything he knew about precision marksmanship. He looked from the timepiece to the target downrange, then back to the girl who was calmly setting her unusual weapon aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice cracked slightly as he spoke into the microphone, "we have a new state record." The crowd erupted, but not everyone was celebrating. In the back row of the viewing stands, a group of men in expensive shooting jackets exchanged uncomfortable glances. These were the same individuals who, just hours before, had made Sarah the target of their jokes and condescending remarks. But this story doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with doubt, ridicule, and a young woman who refused to let anyone's opinion define her capabilities. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riverside County Shooting Range. As competitors began arriving for the annual Western States Precision Championship, this wasn't just any competition. It was the most prestigious marksmanship event west of the Mississippi, drawing elite shooters from across the region. The entry fee alone was $1,500, and the waiting list stretched 2 years deep. Sarah Chen pulled into the parking lot driving a rusted 1998 Honda Civic that sounded like it was held together by hope and determination. The exhaust pipe rattled against the undercarriage as she turned off the engine, creating a stark contrast to the luxury trucks and SUVs surrounding her. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching through her windshield as men in pristine shooting jackets unloaded cases worth more than her car. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She'd worked a double shift at Murphy's Auto Parts the night before to afford the gas money for the 4-hour drive from her hometown of Millfield. At 17, Sarah was already helping support her family after her father's construction accident left him unable to work. Her mother cleaned offices downtown, and her younger brother Tommy needed medication for his asthma that insurance barely covered. Sarah opened her car door and stepped out, immediately conscious of how different she looked from the other competitors. While they wore matching team jackets with sponsor logos and carried equipment cases that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Sarah wore her cleanest pair of jeans, work boots that had seen better days, and a flannel shirt that belonged to her father. But it was what she pulled from her trunk that really set her apart. The rifle case wasn't a case at all. It was a canvas tarp wrapped around her weapon and secured with bungee cords. As she unwrapped it in the parking lot, several nearby competitors stopped their conversations to stare. What they saw defied every convention of precision shooting equipment. The rifle Sarah had built measured exactly 42 inches from butt to muzzle, but it looked like it had been assembled from 3 different decades of firearms technology. The receiver was machined aluminum she'd acquired from a scrapyard, meticulously shaped by hand in the high school workshop where she volunteered as a teaching assistant. The barrel had come from a hunting rifle that failed safety inspection, which Sarah had rebored and rifled using techniques she'd learned from YouTube videos and library books. The stock was perhaps the most unusual component. Carved from a piece of black walnut that had fallen during the storm near her house, it bore the natural grain and character that no factory could replicate. Sarah had spent months shaping it with hand tools, creating custom contours that fit her specific build and shooting style. Where most competition rifles featured adjustable components, Sarah's was fitted precisely to her measurements, carved to accommodate the exact length of her arms and the way she naturally positioned her cheek. The scope mounted on top told its own story of resourcefulness. It was a vintage Weaver from the 1970s that Sarah had found at a pawn shop for $30. The glass was clean, but the housing showed decades of wear. Sarah had rebuilt the internal mechanisms herself, replacing springs and adjusters with parts she'd machined on the school's lathe during lunch periods. "Registration is inside the main building," called out a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see a middle-aged man approaching. He wore a red jacket emblazoned with the logo of Precision Arms Manufacturing, and his belt buckle featured the symbol of the National Rifle Association. His name tag read Dale Morrison, Range Safety Officer. "Thank you," Sarah replied, shouldering her improvised case. Dale's eyes lingered on her weapon for a moment, longer than was polite. "First time competing at this level?" "Yes, sir." "Well, just so you know, all firearms have to pass inspection before the competition begins. We have pretty strict standards here." There was something in his tone that suggested he doubted her homemade rifle would meet those standards. Sarah simply nodded and headed toward the building. The registration area buzzed with activity as competitors checked in, reviewed course rules, and examined the day's target specifications. Sarah approached the desk where a volunteer with perfectly styled gray hair looked up from her clipboard. "Name?" "Sarah Chen." The woman scanned her list, running a manicured finger down the entries. "Here you are, Division C, Women's Open Class." She looked up at Sarah with a smile that seemed genuine. "You're our youngest competitor this year." "Yes, ma'am." "Well, good luck, dear. The inspection station is right over there." Sarah followed her gesture to a table where two officials were examining rifles with practiced efficiency. She joined the line behind a man whose competition weapon looked like it belonged in a museum of precision engineering. Every surface gleamed, every component was perfectly aligned, and the price tag would have covered Sarah's family's rent for half a year. "Jesus Christ, would you look at that thing?" The voice came from somewhere behind her in line. Sarah didn't turn around, but she could feel the stares intensifying. "Is that duct tape?" Another voice whispered, though not quietly enough. "Looks like something my kid would build in shop class." The comments continued, growing bolder as more competitors noticed Sarah's rifle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the inspection process ahead of her. "I'm telling you, Martha, they're letting anyone in these days," said an older man whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Used to be. You needed proper equipment to compete at this level." When Sarah finally reached the inspection table, the two officials exchanged a quick glance. The senior inspector, whose badge identified him as Chief Range Officer Tom Bradley, gestured for Sarah to place her rifle on the examination mat. "Well, this is certainly unique," Bradley said, adjusting his glasses. He began his inspection methodically, checking the action, examining the barrel, testing the trigger mechanism. His partner, a younger man named Kevin Walsh, took detailed measurements and recorded specifications on his tablet. "Action functions smoothly," Bradley muttered to himself, cycling the bolt repeatedly. "Trigger pull is..." He tested it with a gauge, exactly 4 pounds 2 ounces. "That's actually quite good." Walsh measured the barrel length and diameter, then peered through the bore with a specialized light. Rifling looks clean and consistent. Chamber dimensions appear standard. As the inspection continued, a small crowd gathered around the table. Sarah could hear the whispered comments and barely contained chuckles from the spectators. Bore scope shows no irregularities, Walsh reported, having threaded a fiber optic camera down the barrel. Actually, this rifling pattern is really interesting. Did you cut this yourself? Yes, sir, Sarah answered quietly. How? Single-point cutting tool on a converted lathe. Took about 40 hours to complete all the grooves. Bradley looked up from his examination, clearly surprised. You cut rifle grooves by hand? Yes, sir. Had to modify the lathe to achieve the right twist rate, but the principle is the same as industrial production. The crowd had grown larger, and the comments were becoming less subtle. 40 hours of amateur work versus precision manufacturing, scoffed a voice from the back. This should be interesting. Hope she brought Band-Aids for when that scope cuts her face, added another. Bradley continued his inspection, checking the stock dimensions and examining the scope mounting system. Sarah had fabricated her own rings from aluminum stock, turning them on the school lathe to exact specifications. The mounting system was unconventional but clearly functional. Scope rings are handmade too. Walsh asked. Yes, sir. Standard rings wouldn't fit the vintage scope base properly. And this stock carving, this is all by hand? Yes, sir. Use traditional woodworking tools, mostly. Chisels, rasps, sandpaper. Bradley ran his fingers along the stock's contours, feeling the smooth finish and perfect fit. Despite its homemade appearance, the craftsmanship was undeniably skilled. Range safety requires a test fire, he announced to the crowd. We need to verify that the rifle functions safely and accurately. At a basic level. This was standard procedure for any firearm that hadn't been previously certified at their facility. But the announcement drew even more spectators. Word had spread throughout the range about the teenager with the homemade rifle, and competitors began abandoning their own preparations to watch the spectacle. Sarah followed Bradley to a test firing position 50 yards from a standard target. The audience formed a semicircle behind the firing line, their expensive rifles propped against the nearby bench rest. 3 shots for group measurement, Bradley explained. Just need to verify basic functionality and safety. Sarah nodded and settled into shooting position. The moment she shouldered her rifle, her entire demeanor changed. The nervous teenager disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with practiced confidence and precision. She adjusted the scope with small, deliberate movements, then settled into her natural point of aim. Her breathing slowed and deepened. The range noise faded into background static. Sarah's finger found the trigger, applying pressure so gradually that the shot surprised even her when it broke. The rifle's report echoed across the range, but it was quieter than expected. Sarah had incorporated a simple but effective muzzle brake into her barrel design, reducing both noise and recoil. She cycled the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. The second shot followed 20 seconds later, then the third after another measured pause. "Cease fire," Bradley called, though Sarah had already set her rifle down and engaged the safety. Walsh jogged downrange to retrieve the target while the crowd waited in anticipation. When he returned, holding the target up for examination, the comments and chuckles died away abruptly. All 3 shots had created a single ragged hole in the center of the bull's eye. Bradley measured the group with calipers, double-checked his reading, then measured again. .78 inches, he announced to the silent crowd. At 50 yards. For context, most factory rifles couldn't achieve that level of accuracy, and many competition rifles struggled to perform better. Sarah's homemade weapon had just demonstrated precision that would be impressive at any level of competition. The silence stretched for several seconds before someone in the crowd muttered, "Must be luck." "Beginner's luck," agreed another voice, though with less conviction than before. Bradley handed Sarah a certification sticker for her rifle case. "You're cleared for competition," he said quietly. "That's some fine shooting. Thank you, sir." As Sarah walked back toward the main building, carrying her wrapped rifle and leaving a crowd of confused competitors behind, she could hear the renewed conversation starting up. "Probably can't repeat it under pressure. Competition's different from plinking at a practice target. Wait until she has to deal with wind and distance." Sarah said nothing, but she allowed herself a small smile. These men had no idea what kind of pressure she'd been dealing with her entire life, or what kinds of conditions she'd learned to shoot in. The registration building had transformed into a hub of pre-competition activity. Competitors studied course maps, adjusted their scopes, and engaged in the ritual of checking and rechecking their equipment. Sarah found a quiet corner where she could prepare without drawing more attention than she'd already attracted. She opened her small backpack and removed her competition supplies. Where other shooters carried expensive range bags filled with specialized tools and accessories, Sarah's gear fit in a high school backpack that showed signs of daily use. Her ammunition was stored in recycled plastic containers that had once held hardware store bolts. Her shooting mat was a folded canvas tarp. Her spotting scope was a vintage telescope she'd modified with a tripod mount. But everything worked, and more importantly, everything had been tested extensively. Sarah had been shooting competitively for only 2 years, but she'd been handling firearms since she was 8 years old. Her father had taught her on their small family property outside Millfield, starting with a .22 rifle that was older than she was. When money got tight after the accident, Sarah had taken over the hunting that helped supplement their grocery budget. She'd learned to make every shot count because ammunition cost money they didn't have. She'd learned to shoot in all weather conditions because deer season didn't wait for perfect days. She'd learned to maintain and repair firearms because gunsmiths were expensive and far away. Most importantly, she'd learned that equipment was only as good as the person using it. The building's PA system crackled to life. "Attention competitors, the safety briefing will begin in 10 minutes. Please gather in the main conference room." Sarah packed her gear and joined the migration toward the back of the building. The conference room was set up theater-style with rows of folding chairs facing a podium. As competitors filed in, Sarah noticed the subtle social dynamics at play. The elite shooters, men with professional sponsors and national rankings, occupied the front rows. They wore matching team jackets and carried themselves with the confidence that came from years of success. Behind them sat the serious amateurs, weekend warriors with high-quality equipment and decades of experience. Sarah found herself directed toward the back rows with the other first-time competitors and newcomers. It was here that she encountered her first direct confrontation. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Sarah looked up to see a man in his 50s standing in the aisle beside her row. He wore an expensive shooting jacket with multiple sponsor patches and his name tag identified him as Robert Bob Martinez, a 3-time state champion from California. "No, sir, go ahead," Sarah replied, sliding over to make room. Martinez settled into the chair with a grunt, then turned to examine Sarah more closely. "You're the young lady with the interesting rifle?" "I suppose so." "Built it yourself?" "I heard, yes, sir." Martinez chuckled, but it wasn't entirely unfriendly. "You know, I've been shooting competitively for 32 years. Started when I was about your age, actually. But I always used proper equipment, rifles designed by people who understand precision marksmanship." He paused, clearly expecting a response. When Sarah remained quiet, he continued, "The thing is, kiddo, this isn't a hobby match at your local gun club. This is serious competition against people who've dedicated their lives to this sport. The Equipment matters. The precision matters. Every tiny detail matters. I understand that, sir. Do you? Because what I saw out there in the parking lot looked like a science fair project. And while I admire your creativity, I'd hate to see you embarrass yourself when the real shooting starts. Sarah turned to face Martinez directly. What? Makes you think I'll embarrass myself? Well, for starters, that scope you're using is older than you are. The stock looks like it was carved with a butter knife. And I'm pretty sure I saw duct tape holding something together. The scope has been rebuilt with modern internals. The stock is carved to fit my specific measurements, which actually provides better consistency than adjustable components. And that's not duct tape. It's specialized barrel bedding tape that prevents vibration resonance. Martinez raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting such a technical response. You seem to know the terminology. I know more than terminology. Before Martinez could respond, the room's lights dimmed and the safety briefing began. Chief Range Officer Bradley took the podium and began reviewing the day's schedule and safety protocols. Today's competition consists of 3 stages. He announced. Stage 1 is precision shooting at known distances. Stage 2 introduces environmental variables, including wind and elevation changes. Stage 3 is our championship round, featuring unknown distances and time pressure. Sarah listened carefully as Bradley explained the scoring system and range commands. This was more complex than the local competitions she'd participated in, with stricter rules and higher standards. Equipment inspections have been completed. Bradley continued. I want to remind everyone that this competition operates under strict fairness guidelines. Every shooter, regardless of experience level or equipment cost, has earned their place here through qualification scores. He paused and looked directly at the section where Sarah was sitting. Sometimes the most impressive performances come from the most unexpected places. As the briefing concluded and competitors began moving toward the range, Martinez stood and turned back to Sarah. Listen, kid, I didn't mean to sound discouraging earlier. It's just that, well, some of these guys have been shooting longer than you've been alive. The pressure can get to anyone. I appreciate the concern. Sarah replied evenly. But pressure and I are old friends. Martinez studied her face for a moment, seeing something there that made him reconsider his assumptions. You know what? I hope you prove me wrong. I intend to. The staging area adjacent to the firing line buzzed with nervous energy as competitors prepared for the first stage. Sarah found herself assigned to firing position 23, near the end of the line of shooters. This actually suited her fine, as it meant fewer people would be watching her directly. She unrolled her canvas tarp shooting mat and arranged her equipment with practiced efficiency. Her ammunition was organized in the order she'd needed her. Spotting scope was positioned for quick target acquisition, and her rifle was laid out with the bolt open and chamber empty as required by range safety rules. To her left, she could see a shooter with equipment worth more than her father's annual salary before the accident. To her right sat a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Janet Wilson, a nurse from Oregon who'd been competing for 15 years. First time at Western States? Janet asked while adjusting her scope settings. Yes, ma'am. It's a tough course. These guys don't make it easy. Janet gestured toward the targets, which were visible as small squares in the distance. The wind here is tricky. Comes down off those hills in gusts that'll push your shot off target faster than you can compensate. Have you shot here before? 3 times. Never placed higher than 15th, but I keep coming back. The competition makes you better, even when it beats you up. Janet noticed Sarah's rifle for the first time and did a double take. Wow, that's unique. Did you build that? I did. I've never seen anything quite like it. May I? Janet gestured toward the rifle. Sarah nodded, and Janet examined the weapon with the practiced eye of someone who understood firearms. This stock work is incredible. Janet said, running her fingers along the carved wood. "The checkering is hand-cut, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am. 24 lines per inch." "And this barrel? It's not factory?" "I machined it from bar stock. Had to design my own reamer for the chamber." Janet looked up with new respect. "You machined a rifle barrel from scratch?" "Yes, ma'am. That's not something you learn in a weekend workshop. Took me about 6 months to get it right. The first 2 attempts didn't work." Before Janet could respond, the range commands began. "All shooters to the firing line. Load and make ready." Sarah settled behind her rifle and chambered her first round. The target at 100 yards looked impossibly small through her vintage scope, but she'd practiced at this distance hundreds of times on her family's property. "Shooters ready. Watch your lane. Shoot when ready." The first stage allowed unlimited time for each shot, with scoring based purely on accuracy. Sarah settled into position and began her shooting routine, the same sequence she'd developed through thousands of practice rounds. Her first shot broke clean and smooth. Through her spotting scope, she could see the bullet hole appear just left of the target center. Not perfect, but well within the scoring ring. She made a small windage adjustment and fired her second shot. This one struck closer to center. By her 5th and final shot of the first string, Sarah had found her rhythm completely. The bullet struck the target's center ring with precision that drew attention from nearby competitors. "That's some nice shooting," Janet commented during the break between strings. Sarah was about to respond when she heard voices from the group of elite competitors gathered around the spotting scopes behind the firing line. "Looks like the little girl with the toy rifle is holding her own so far. Wait until the wind picks up. That's when real equipment makes the difference. Or when the pressure gets to her. I've seen plenty of good practice shooters fall apart in competition." The comments weren't directed at Sarah specifically, but they were spoken loud enough for her and the other nearby competitors to hear. It was psychological warfare, as much a part of the competition as technical skill. Sarah said nothing, but she felt something familiar stirring inside her chest. It was the same feeling she got when her boss at the auto parts store implied that a 17-year-old girl couldn't understand carburetor rebuild kits, or when her chemistry teacher suggested she might want to consider less challenging classes. It was the feeling of being underestimated, and Sarah had learned to use that feeling as fuel. The second string of targets went up at 150 yards, and the wind had indeed picked up. Flags along the range showed gusts coming from varying directions, creating the kind of conditions that separated amateur marksmen from serious competitors. Sarah studied the wind patterns carefully, watching how the gusts affected the flags at different distances. Wind didn't affect bullets uniformly along their path. A gust at 50 yards might push the bullet one way, while still air at the target allowed it to drift back toward center. She fired her second string with careful attention to timing, waiting for lulls in the wind and making precise adjustments between shots. Her grouping was tighter than the first string, despite the more challenging conditions. By the time the first stage concluded, Sarah had fired 60 shots at distances ranging from 100 to 300 yards. As the competitors moved off the firing line to examine their targets and wait for scoring, she could sense a shift in the atmosphere around her. The joking comments had become less frequent and less confident. Several competitors had begun watching her shooting routine with professional interest rather than amusement. Her performance was speaking louder than any equipment disparagement. Janet Wilson approached while Sarah was cleaning her rifle. "I've been watching your wind calls," Janet said quietly. "Where did you learn to read conditions like that?" "Experience. I guess. I hunt a lot back home, and the wind is always doing something different. Hunting's different from competition, though. The pressure, the time constraints. I work 2 jobs to help support my family," Sarah replied, not boastfully, but as a simple statement of fact. "I've been supporting myself since I was 15. Pressure is relative." Janet nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just another teenage shooter trying to prove something. This was someone who had already been tested by circumstances far more challenging than any sporting competition. The PA system announced the first stage scores, reading them in reverse order from lowest to highest. Sarah's name was called in the middle of the pack, a respectable showing for a first-time competitor. But more importantly, she was ahead of several shooters whose equipment costs exceeded her family's annual income. As they prepared for the second stage, which would introduce moving targets and unknown distances, Sarah noticed that the comments from the elite group had stopped entirely. She was no longer being dismissed as a curiosity or an amusing distraction. She was being recognized as competition. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the early mist and revealing the full complexity of the range layout. The second stage would test shooters on a course that wound through natural terrain, with targets placed at various distances and angles. Some were partially concealed behind barriers, others were positioned to take advantage of tricky wind patterns. Sarah slung her rifle and followed the group toward the second stage starting line. The atmosphere had changed subtly but significantly. Where the morning had begun with barely concealed mockery and condescending advice, there was now a more serious, more respectful tone. But the real test was still ahead. As she approached the starting line for Stage 2, Sarah Chen, the 17-year-old girl with the homemade rifle and the discount store ammunition, was no longer an object of amusement. She was a contender. And the elite shooters who had spent the morning making jokes were beginning to realize that their assumptions might have been dangerously wrong. The course marshal checked his watch and called for the second stage to begin. Sarah stepped up to the starting line, shouldered her unconventional rifle, and prepared to show exactly what kind of pressure she could handle. Behind her, the whispered comments had taken on a very different tone. Did you see her wind calls on that last string? That grouping at 300 yards. Maybe we shouldn't have been so quick to judge. But Sarah wasn't listening to the comments anymore. Her entire focus had narrowed to the challenge ahead and the familiar feeling of proving doubters wrong. The second stage was about to begin, and Sarah Chen was ready to make some people very uncomfortable with their assumptions. The second stage course stretched across 200 acres of rolling terrain, designed to simulate real-world shooting. Scenarios that would challenge even the most experienced marksmen. Unlike the controlled environment of the first stage, this portion of the competition required shooters to navigate natural obstacles while engaging targets at unknown distances under constantly changing conditions. Sarah stood at the entrance to the course, studying the terrain map provided by the range officers. The route wound through a series of checkpoints, each presenting different shooting challenges. Some required prone shooting from behind natural cover. Others demanded precision from awkward positions or elevated platforms. The targets themselves were steel silhouettes that would ring audibly when struck, providing immediate feedback but also announcing each shooter's performance to everyone within earshot. Course Marshal David Thompson, a retired Marine with 30 years of competitive shooting experience, gathered the competitors for the stage briefing. His weathered face and calm demeanor commanded immediate respect from the assembled shooters. Ladies and gentlemen, Stage 2 is where we separate the range shooters from the field shooters, Thompson announced. You'll encounter 12 target engagements over a 2-mile course. Distances range from 75 yards to 600 yards, and some targets will only be visible from specific shooting positions. He pointed to various locations on the large terrain map mounted on an easel. Weather conditions will be a significant factor. The course runs through 3 different microclimates, including a valley section where wind patterns can be unpredictable. Each shooter will be accompanied by a safety officer, but you're on your own for range estimation and environmental compensation. Sarah absorbed every detail, mentally cataloging the challenges ahead. Unlike many of her competitors, she'd never had access to laser rangefinders or ballistic computers. Her shooting experience had been built on developing the ability to estimate distances by eye and compensate for environmental factors through observation and instinct. Time limit is 90 minutes from start to finish, Thompson continued. Miss that deadline and you'll be disqualified regardless of your target performance. Questions? A hand raised from the group of elite shooters. Are we allowed to use personal range-finding equipment? Negative. This stage tests your ability to make accurate shots under field conditions, which means using your eyes and experience to judge distance and wind. This announcement created a stir among the competitors. Many had become dependent on electronic aids that eliminated much of the guesswork from long-range shooting. Sarah felt a small surge of confidence as this requirement played directly to her strengths. Shooters would be released onto the course at 5-minute intervals based on their first stage rankings. This meant Sarah would start somewhere in the middle of the pack, giving her the advantage of hearing the target strikes from earlier shooters while not being so late that time pressure became a significant factor. As she waited for her turn, Sarah noticed Robert Martinez preparing for his run. The veteran competitor was methodically checking his equipment and reviewing range cards that contained detailed notes from previous competitions at this facility. His rifle was a custom-built precision instrument worth more than Sarah's family car, equipped with every legal advantage that money could buy. "Chen, you're up in 10 minutes," called Thompson. Sarah began her pre-stage routine, checking her rifle's zero with a few dry-fire exercises and mentally rehearsing her approach to each checkpoint based on the terrain map. She'd loaded her magazine with carefully selected ammunition each round, hand-loaded to precise specifications using components she'd saved for months to afford. Her cartridges were assembled on a single-stage press she'd borrowed from her high school shop teacher, using powder charges measured to the 1/10 of a grain, and bullets seated to exact specifications. While other competitors had access to expensive reloading equipment and premium components, Sarah had achieved consistency through meticulous attention to detail and extensive testing. "Sarah Chen, you're on deck." She approached the starting line where Thompson waited with Safety Officer Mike Harrison, a local deputy sheriff who volunteered at shooting events. Harrison would shadow her throughout the course, ensuring safety protocols while remaining neutral about her performance. "Any questions about the course layout?" Thompson asked. "No, sir. I'm ready. Remember, this is about more than just hitting targets. We're evaluating your ability to adapt to changing conditions and make good decisions under pressure. Take your time, but don't waste time." Thompson raised his stopwatch. "Shooter ready? Ready. Your time starts now." Sarah moved off the starting line at a measured pace, her rifle slung across her shoulder and her small pack containing extra ammunition and basic supplies. The first checkpoint was visible 300 yards ahead, marked by orange flags that indicated the designated shooting position. The terrain was more challenging than it had appeared from the starting area. The path wound through tall grass and scattered boulders, requiring careful foot placement to avoid twisted ankles or stumbles that could affect shooting stability. Sarah's work boots, which had drawn snickers in the parking lot that morning, proved perfectly suited for the rough ground. As she approached the first checkpoint, she could hear the distinctive ping of steel targets being struck by earlier competitors. The sound carried clearly across the valley, providing valuable intelligence about wind conditions and target locations. The first shooting position was a natural depression behind a fallen log, offering stable prone support while requiring the shooter to engage targets across a creek bed. Sarah settled into position and began scanning for her targets through her vintage scope. The first target materialized as she adjusted her focus, a steel silhouette positioned on the far side of the creek at what appeared to be roughly 200 yards. The range seemed straightforward enough, but Sarah noticed that the target was positioned in a gap between two hills that would create a wind tunnel effect. She spent 30 seconds studying the environmental conditions, watching grass movement and feeling air currents on her face. The wind was coming from her right at approximately 8 to 10 miles per hour, with occasional gusts that increased the velocity significantly. Sarah calculated her hold off and settled into her shooting position. Her breathing steadied, her finger found the trigger, and she applied pressure gradually until the shot broke with a clean surprise. The metallic ping of the steel target rang across the valley, confirming a solid hit. Sarah cycled her bolt and moved on without celebration, aware that 11 more targets awaited and time was a constant factor. The second checkpoint required a significant elevation change, climbing 50 feet up a rocky slope to a shooting platform overlooking the valley. By the time Sarah reached the position, she could feel her heart rate elevated from the climb, requiring a brief pause to allow her pulse to settle before attempting precision shooting. This target was significantly more challenging. Located on the opposite hillside at an estimated 400 yards, it was partially concealed behind brush and positioned at a steep downward angle. The elevated shooting position also meant that wind conditions were different from what she'd experienced at creek level. Sarah studied the target through her scope, noting how the morning sun created shadows that made range estimation more difficult. She used a technique her father had taught her, comparing the apparent size of the target to known reference points and applying the mathematical relationships between size, distance, and angular measurement. Her range estimate was 420 yards, with a steep enough downward angle to require compensation for the altered ballistic trajectory. The wind at this elevation was lighter but more variable, switching direction as air currents navigated around the terrain features. She adjusted her scope's elevation turret based on her range estimation and settled into a solid shooting position. The platform was less stable than natural ground, requiring her to use her rifle sling as additional support to minimize movement. The shot felt perfect as it broke, and the subsequent ping confirmed another successful engagement. Sarah was building confidence in her ability to read the course conditions, but she also recognized that the challenges would only increase as the stage progressed. The third checkpoint involved crossing a small stream and climbing through dense brush to reach a shooting position on the opposite bank. The path was poorly marked, requiring navigation skills in addition to shooting ability. Sarah's experience hunting in difficult terrain served her well as she picked her way through the obstacles without damaging her equipment or exhausting herself unnecessarily. As she emerged from the brush at the third position, she encountered her first major surprise. Instead of a single target, 3 steel silhouettes were positioned at different ranges and angles, requiring rapid engagement from a single shooting position. This was clearly designed to test both speed and accuracy under pressure. Sarah quickly identified the 3 targets through her scope. The closest was approximately 150 yards to her left, positioned behind a low earthwork. The second was straight ahead at roughly 300 yards, fully exposed but requiring precise elevation adjustment. The third was the most challenging, located on a distant hillside at what appeared to be close to 500 yards. The logical sequence was to engage from closest to farthest, allowing her to gauge wind conditions on the shorter shots before attempting the long-range target. Sarah adjusted her position to engage the first target and fired without hesitation. Ping, first target down. She swung her rifle toward the second target, made a quick elevation adjustment, and fired again. Ping, second target hit. The third target required more careful consideration. At 500 yards, small errors in range estimation or wind compensation would result in complete misses. Sarah studied the target carefully, using every technique she'd learned for long-range shooting. The wind at that distance appeared lighter than at her position, based on the movement of vegetation visible through her scope. She estimated the range at 480 yards and adjusted her scope accordingly. The wind hold would be minimal if her read was correct. Sarah settled into the most stable position possible and focused on executing perfect shooting fundamentals. The trigger broke cleanly, and she watched through her scope as the bullet traveled downrange. Ping! Third target engaged successfully. She was making good time and shooting well, but Sarah knew the course was designed to become progressively more difficult. The next several checkpoints would test her skills in ways that static range shooting never could. The fourth position required shooting from behind a barricade that simulated urban combat conditions. The target was visible only through a narrow gap between concrete barriers, requiring precise positioning to achieve a clean sight picture. Additionally, the shooting position was awkward, requiring her to support the rifle's weight without the benefit of a stable rest. Sarah had practiced shooting from unconventional positions during her hunting experiences, when clean shots often required adapting to whatever cover was available. She braced her rifle against the concrete barrier and used her non-firing hand to create additional stability. The target was at moderate range, approximately 250 yards, but the restricted sight picture made precise aiming more challenging. Sarah took extra time to ensure proper sight alignment before firing. Ping! Another successful engagement. As she moved toward the fifth checkpoint, Sarah began to notice that the sounds of other competitors shooting had become less frequent. Either the earlier shooters were struggling with the more challenging targets, or they were taking significantly more time to ensure accuracy. The fifth position presented a completely different challenge. The shooting location was on a steep hillside, requiring her to engage targets while dealing with significant lateral slope. Shooting from uneven ground affected both rifle stability and the bullet's trajectory, requiring compensation techniques that few shooters ever practiced. Sarah found a shooting position that provided the best possible stability given the terrain constraints. The target was visible across a narrow canyon at an estimated 350 yards, with crosswind conditions that were difficult to read due to the terrain features. She spent extra time studying the wind patterns, looking for consistent indicators of air movement at the target location. A small cluster of trees near the target provided some reference, and Sarah could see their movement patterns through her scope. Her shot felt good, but instead of the expected ping, she heard the distinctive whine of a bullet striking rock nearby the target. A miss, her first of the stage. Sarah quickly analyzed what had gone wrong. The range estimation had been accurate, based on the target's apparent size, but the steep angle and challenging wind conditions had combined to push her shot just outside the target zone. She had one more cartridge available for this position, as stage rules allowed a single follow-up shot if the first attempt missed. Sarah made a slight adjustment to her wind hold and fired again. Ping! The second shot connected solidly. The sixth checkpoint was where the course design revealed its true complexity. The shooting position was located in a small clearing surrounded by trees, creating highly variable wind conditions as air currents were disrupted by the vegetation. Multiple targets were visible at different ranges, but they could only be engaged in a specific sequence based on sightline restrictions. Sarah studied the target array carefully, identifying the required engagement sequence. The first target was partially concealed behind a tree trunk, visible only from a specific angle within the shooting area. The second required shooting through a gap in the canopy overhead. The third was located across an open field, but positioned to take advantage of the most challenging wind conditions. She positioned herself to engage the first target and immediately understood why this checkpoint was considered particularly difficult. The available shooting angle was so narrow that even small movements would block her sight picture entirely. Sarah had to contort her body into an uncomfortable position to achieve the necessary alignment. The first shot required perfect trigger control, as any movement during the firing sequence would disturb her precarious shooting position. Sarah focused on her breathing and trigger technique, applying pressure so gradually that the shot surprised her when it fired. Ping, first target. Down. Repositioning for the second target required climbing over a fallen log and shooting from a kneeling position to clear the overhead obstacles. This was far from ideal for precision shooting, but the course design left no alternatives. Sarah used her rifle sling to create additional stability in the kneeling position, a technique she'd learned during hunting situations where prone shooting wasn't possible. The target was at moderate range, but the awkward shooting position made consistent accuracy challenging. Her second shot connected, and she moved to address the final target from this position. The third target was the most demanding yet, requiring a shot across open ground where wind conditions were clearly visible but constantly changing. Sarah watched the grass movement in the field, noting how the wind patterns shifted every few seconds. She would need to time her shot to coincide with a period of relatively stable conditions. After observing for nearly a minute, she identified a brief lull in the wind activity and fired immediately. The shot connected with authority, producing the satisfying ring of steel that confirmed her read had been accurate. Checkpoint 7. Required navigating a steep descent into a ravine, then climbing the opposite bank to reach the shooting position. The physical demands of the course were becoming significant, and Sarah could feel fatigue beginning to affect her stability. The target from this position was located on high ground across the ravine, requiring a steep upward angle that would affect bullet trajectory significantly. At an estimated 300 yards with a 30-degree upward angle, the shot would require careful ballistic compensation. Sarah had studied the mathematics of angled shooting, understanding that steep shots required different elevation adjustments than level fire. She calculated the horizontal equivalent of the angled shot and adjusted her scope accordingly. The wind in the ravine was almost non-existent, but she could see flags on the distant hillside indicating significant air movement at the target location. This created a complex ballistic problem where wind effects would only influence the bullet during the final portion of its flight path. Her shot placement was slightly high, but well within the target zone, producing another successful engagement. Sarah was maintaining good accuracy despite the increasing complexity of the challenges. The 8th checkpoint presented the course's most physically demanding challenge yet. The shooting position was located at the top of a steep climbing route that required both hands for safe navigation. Sarah had to secure her rifle carefully during the climb, ensuring that the scope and delicate adjustments weren't damaged by contact with rocks or vegetation. By the time she reached the shooting position, her heart rate was significantly elevated and her breathing was labored from the physical exertion. Unlike range shooting, where competitors could take all the time needed to achieve perfect stability, field conditions required the ability to shoot accurately while dealing with physical stress. Sarah forced herself to wait until her pulse settled and her breathing returned to a manageable rhythm. The target from this elevated position was visible far below in the valley, requiring a steep downward shot at extended range. The distance appeared to be approximately 450 yards, with the steep downward angle requiring significant ballistic compensation. Additionally, the elevation difference meant that wind conditions at her position were completely different from those affecting the bullet's path at lower altitudes. She studied the target location carefully, noting wind indicators at various elevations between her position and the target. The air movement appeared to be layered, with different velocities and directions at different altitudes. Sarah's shot felt perfect as it broke, and she watched through her scope as the bullet arced downward toward the distant target. The flight time seemed extended due to the range, but the eventual ping confirmed another successful engagement. Checkpoint 9 required descending back into the valley and navigating through a section of dense forest where the target was only briefly visible through gaps in the vegetation. This was designed to simulate hunting conditions where quick, accurate shots were required when opportunities presented themselves. Sarah moved through the forest quietly, using techniques learned during years of deer hunting. The target was positioned to be visible only from specific locations along the trail, requiring her to identify the optimal shooting position while moving through challenging terrain. When the target became visible through a break in the trees, Sarah had only seconds to establish a shooting position and make an accurate shot before the sight line was blocked again. This was exactly the type of shooting that had prepared her for competitive challenges, where quick decision-making and instinctive accuracy were essential. She dropped into a supported kneeling position behind a large tree and fired almost immediately. Upon acquiring a clear sight picture, the range was moderate, approximately 200 yards, but the narrow window of opportunity made the shot technically demanding. Ping! Another successful engagement. The 10th checkpoint marked the beginning of the course's final section, where the most challenging targets awaited. The shooting position was located on an exposed ridge where wind conditions were strong and variable. Multiple targets were visible at extreme ranges, testing the limits of both equipment and shooter capability. Sarah could see 3 targets, positioned at what appeared to be 500, 600, and 700 yards respectively. These were the distances where small errors in technique or equipment limitations would become magnified into complete misses. She began with the closest target, using it to gauge wind conditions for the longer shots. At 500 yards, her vintage scope was approaching the limits of its effective magnification, making precise target identification challenging. Sarah had loaded special long-range ammunition for these final targets, using heavier bullets with better ballistic coefficients to maintain accuracy at extended distances. The cartridges represented months of experimentation and testing to develop loads that would perform consistently from her hand-built rifle. Her first shot at the 500-yard target connected solidly, confirming that her rifle was performing well at extended range. She adjusted her scope for the 600-yard target and studied the wind conditions carefully. At this distance, the wind effects became extremely significant. A 10-mile-per-hour crosswind would push her bullet nearly 2 feet off target, making precise wind estimation critical for success. Sarah fired at the 600-yard target and heard the distinctive ping indicating a successful hit. Her confidence was building as she prepared for the most challenging shot of the stage. The 700-yard target represented the outer limit of her rifle's effective range. At this distance, her hand-loaded ammunition would be dropping significantly, and any wind effects would be magnified dramatically. This was the shot that would separate capable shooters from exceptional ones. She spent several minutes studying the wind conditions at various points along the bullet's path. The shot would cross 3 different terrain features, each creating different wind patterns that would affect the bullet's flight. Sarah made her final scope adjustments and settled into the most stable shooting position possible on the exposed ridge. The wind was gusty and variable, requiring her to time the shot carefully to coincide with the most favorable conditions. When the wind indicators showed a brief period of relative stability, Sarah fired immediately. The shot felt perfect, but at 700 yards, the bullet flight time was long enough that wind conditions could change significantly between firing and impact. The wait seemed endless, but eventually the metallic ring of the distant target confirmed her most challenging shot of the day. Sarah had successfully engaged all 3 long-range targets, demonstrating that her homemade rifle could compete with the most expensive equipment when combined with skilled shooting. The 11th checkpoint required navigating back down into the valley for one of the course's most technically demanding challenges. The target was positioned across a small lake, requiring the shooter to account for the optical effects of shooting over water as well as the unique wind patterns created by the water surface. Shooting over water created several complications that many competitors had never encountered. The smooth water surface could create mirage effects that made range estimation difficult, and the air temperature differences between water and land created wind patterns that were often counterintuitive. Sarah had encountered similar conditions while hunting waterfowl on the large reservoir near her hometown. She understood that wind effects over water were often lighter than over land, but that temperature inversions could create vertical air movements that affected bullet trajectory unpredictably. The target was positioned at approximately 400 yards across the lake, requiring a shot that would travel entirely over water. Sarah studied the surface carefully, noting the small wavelets that indicated wind direction and velocity at the water level. Her shot felt good, but instead of the expected ping, she heard the splash of a bullet striking water short of the target. The mirage effect had made the target appear closer than its actual distance, causing her to underestimate the range significantly. Sarah had one follow-up shot available and adjusted her range estimation upward by 50 yards. The second shot connected with the target, but the initial miss reminded her that even experienced shooters could be fooled by unusual environmental conditions. The 12th and final checkpoint was located on a hillside overlooking the entire course, providing a dramatic conclusion to the challenging stage. The target was positioned at moderate range but in a location where wind conditions were extremely complex due to the terrain features. As Sarah climbed toward the final shooting position, she could see other competitors scattered across the course below her. Some were still struggling with earlier checkpoints, while others appeared to be running short on time as the 90-minute deadline approached. The final target was visible across a complex terrain feature that included ridges, valleys, and vegetation that would create multiple wind zones. This was designed as the ultimate test of a shooter's ability to read environmental conditions and make accurate compensation adjustments. Sarah spent extra time studying the wind patterns, knowing that this final shot would be crucial for her overall stage performance. She could see wind indicators at multiple points along the bullet's path, each showing different air movement characteristics. The shot required careful integration of all the environmental factors she'd observed throughout the stage. Range estimation, wind compensation, and precise shooting technique all had to come together for a successful engagement. When Sarah fired her final shot of the stage, she felt the satisfaction of perfect execution. The shot felt exactly right, and the immediate ping of the steel target confirmed that her technique and equipment had performed flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. As she secured her rifle and began the walk back to the staging area, Sarah reflected on her performance throughout the challenging stage. She had successfully engaged every target, with only one initial miss that was corrected with a follow-up shot. More importantly, she had demonstrated that her homemade rifle and hand-loaded ammunition could perform at the highest levels of competitive shooting. The walk back provided an opportunity to observe other competitors still working through the course. Sarah could see shooters struggling with targets that she had engaged successfully, confirming that her performance had been genuinely impressive rather than simply adequate. When she reached the staging area, Course Marshal Thompson was waiting with his scoring tablet and stopwatch. Time was 73 minutes, 42 seconds, he announced. Well within the time limit with a very respectable pace. How did the shooting go? Asked Safety Officer Harrison, who had shadowed her throughout the stage. 11 targets engaged successfully on first shots. One target required a follow-up shot for successful engagement, Thompson recorded. Overall score of 91%, which puts you in the top tier for this stage. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, but kept her expression neutral. The performance had been solid, but she knew that other competitors might have achieved perfect scores or significantly faster times. As she cleaned her rifle and prepared for the final stage, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere around her had changed dramatically from the morning's casual dismissal. Competitors were openly watching her equipment preparation with professional interest rather than amusement. Robert Martinez approached while she was organizing her ammunition for the final stage. "That was some impressive shooting out there," he said, without any trace of his earlier condescension. "I've been competing for 30 years, and I don't think I could have made some of those shots with equipment twice as expensive as yours." "Thank you," Sarah replied simply. "Where did you learn to read wind like that?" "The shot across the lake especially. Most people would have made the same ranging error you corrected. Experience, I guess. I hunt a lot, and you learn to adapt to whatever conditions you encounter." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I think I owe you an apology for my comments earlier. I made assumptions based on your equipment rather than your capability. No apology needed. People usually underestimate what's possible with basic equipment if you understand how to use it properly." As Martinez walked away, Sarah noticed that several other competitors were listening to the conversation with obvious interest. The dynamic had shifted completely from morning dismissal to afternoon respect. But the most challenging portion of the competition was still ahead. The final stage would test everything she had learned about precision shooting under the most demanding conditions the course designers could create. Sarah Chen was no longer the amusing curiosity with the homemade rifle. She was a serious competitor who had proven her capability against the best shooters in the region. The final stage would determine whether she could maintain that performance when everything was on the line. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the championship range as competitors gathered for the final stage briefing. The atmosphere was electric with tension, as this concluding portion would determine the overall winners and establish bragging rights for the coming year. Sarah stood among the assembled shooters, no longer relegated to the back rows, but positioned alongside the recognized elite competitors. Chief Range Officer Bradley stepped to the podium, his expression serious as he prepared to outline the most demanding challenge of the day. Behind him, a large display board showed the current standings after 2 completed stages. Sarah's name appeared in 4th place overall, a position that had stunned many observers and silenced the morning's skeptics entirely. The championship stage represents the ultimate test of marksmanship skill, Bradley announced to the gathered crowd of competitors and spectators. "You'll face precision shooting under extreme time pressure, with targets that will challenge both your technical ability and your mental fortitude." He gestured toward the range layout, where targets were visible at various distances extending beyond the normal boundaries of the facility. 6 targets, positioned from 400 to 1,000 yards. You'll have exactly 12 minutes to engage all targets, with scoring based on both accuracy and time efficiency. A murmur ran through the crowd at the announcement of the 1,000-yard target. This was beyond the capability of many rifles and far beyond the comfort zone of most competitors. At that distance, atmospheric conditions, equipment limitations, and shooter skill would all combine to create an almost impossibly difficult challenge. "Environmental conditions will be deliberately challenging," Bradley continued. "Wind flags have been removed to eliminate visual reference points. You'll rely entirely on natural indicators and personal experience to judge conditions." Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, but it was excitement rather than anxiety. The conditions described played directly to her strengths, as she had never relied on artificial aids for wind estimation. Her hunting background had taught her to read natural signs that many range shooters overlooked entirely. "Each target engagement is scored independently," Bradley explained. "First-round hits receive maximum points with decreasing scores for subsequent shots. Miss completely, and you receive 0 points for that target, regardless of follow-up attempts." The scoring system was designed to reward both speed and accuracy, creating pressure that would test the competitor's ability to balance careful shot placement with time management. Sarah had experienced similar pressure while hunting, where delayed shots often meant missed opportunities and empty-handed returns home. Shooting order will be determined by current standings, with the highest-ranked competitors shooting last. This ensures that leaders have the advantage of knowing what scores they need to achieve. This meant Sarah would shoot relatively early. in the sequence, putting her in the challenging position of setting a benchmark score without knowing what her closest competitors would achieve. However, it also meant she could shoot without the crushing pressure of knowing exactly what was required for victory. As competitors dispersed to prepare their equipment for the final stage, Sarah noticed that the casual conversations and friendly banter of the morning had been replaced by intense focus and nervous energy. Even the most experienced shooters appeared tense as they contemplated the challenges ahead. Janet Wilson approached while Sarah was conducting her final equipment checks. The experienced competitor looked concerned as she studied her own precision rifle, questioning whether her equipment would be adequate for the extreme range targets. "I've never attempted a shot at 1,000 yards, Janet admitted quietly. "My rifle is only zeroed out to 600, and I'm not even sure my scope has enough elevation adjustment for that distance. What's your ballistic drop at 1,000? Sarah asked. "I honestly don't know. I've never calculated it that far out." Sarah pulled a small notebook from her pack, filled with handwritten calculations and environmental data she'd compiled over months of testing her rifle and ammunition. Combination: my loads drop approximately 38 feet at that distance, assuming standard atmospheric conditions. Janet stared at the notebook with amazement. "You've actually calculated trajectories out to 1,000 yards for your homemade ammunition?" "Had to. When you're loading your own cartridges, you need to understand exactly how they'll perform at any distance you might encounter." The preparation area buzzed with activity as competitors made final adjustments to their equipment and reviewed their shooting strategies. Sarah's approach was notably different from those around her, focusing on mental preparation rather than technical modifications. While others frantically adjusted scope settings and tested various ammunition lots, Sarah sat quietly with her eyes closed, visualizing each shot in the sequence. She mentally rehearsed her approach to each target, considering the likely environmental conditions and planning her time management strategy. Her rifle lay beside her, appearing almost crude compared to the high-tech equipment surrounding it. But Sarah knew every nuance of her weapon's performance, understanding exactly how it would respond under any conditions she might encounter. The first competitor was called to the firing line, beginning the sequence that would determine the day's champion. Sarah watched carefully as each shooter approached the challenge, learning from their successes and failures while waiting for her own opportunity. The early shooters struggled with the extreme range targets, with several failing to connect at the 1,000-yard distance entirely. The time pressure was clearly affecting decision-making, as competitors rushed shots that required careful deliberation. When Sarah's name was called, she approached the firing line with calm determination. Range Officer Harrison, who had shadowed her during the second stage, offered encouragement as she settled into position. "Take your time with the setup, but remember that clock starts as soon as you chamber your first round," he advised. Sarah nodded and began her shooting sequence methodically. She had planned her approach carefully during the preparation period, deciding to engage targets from nearest to farthest to establish rhythm and confidence before attempting the most challenging shots. The 400-yard target appeared clearly through her vintage scope as she settled into shooting position. This was well within her comfort zone, requiring minimal environmental compensation under the current conditions. Her first shot broke cleanly, and the immediate ping of steel confirmed a solid hit. Sarah cycled her bolt smoothly and swung toward the 500-yard target without pause. The second target required a modest elevation adjustment and compensation for the light crosswind that had developed during the afternoon. Sarah's shot felt perfect, and the metallic ring confirmed another successful engagement. 600 yards demanded more careful consideration. At this distance, small errors in technique or environmental estimation would result in marginal hits or complete misses. Sarah took an extra moment to study the natural wind indicators before making her scope adjustments. Her third shot connected with authority, producing the satisfying sound that indicated a center hit on the steel target. The crowd of spectators had grown larger as word spread about the 17-year-old's performance, and she could hear murmurs of appreciation from the viewing area. The 700-yard target pushed Sarah's equipment toward its effective limits. Her hand-loaded ammunition was still performing well, but the vintage scope was approaching the maximum useful magnification for precise target identification at that distance. Sarah made careful adjustments to her scope's elevation turret, counting clicks precisely as she compensated for the increased bullet drop. The wind had shifted slightly, requiring her to recalculate her lateral compensation. Her fourth shot took longer to reach the target due to the extended range, but the eventual ping confirmed another successful engagement. Sarah was maintaining perfect accuracy while managing her time efficiently. The 800-yard target represented a significant escalation in difficulty. At this distance, atmospheric conditions became major factors affecting bullet flight, and even perfect shooting technique couldn't overcome equipment limitations indefinitely. Sarah studied the target carefully through her scope, noting how heat mirage was beginning to affect her sight picture as the afternoon temperature climbed. She would need to account for both the extreme range and the optical distortion caused by thermal currents. Her scope's elevation adjustment was approaching its mechanical limits, requiring her to use holdover techniques for the extreme bullet drop. Sarah estimated the necessary holdover carefully, using reference points on her scope's reticle to aim significantly above the target. The fifth shot felt good as it broke, but the extended flight time created suspense as everyone waited for the impact. When the ping finally reached the firing line, confirming another hit, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Sarah now faced the ultimate challenge, the 1,000-yard target that had defeated several previous competitors entirely. At this distance, her homemade rifle would be tested beyond any reasonable expectation for sporting equipment. She took extra time to study the environmental conditions, knowing that small errors would be magnified dramatically at extreme range. The wind had become more complex as thermal currents developed during the afternoon heating, creating layered air movements that would affect the bullet's path differently at various points along its trajectory. Sarah's scope was now at maximum elevation adjustment, requiring significant holdover to compensate for the massive bullet drop at 1,000 yards. Her reticle provided reference points for extreme holdover, but she would essentially be aiming at empty sky above the target. The mental mathematics required for the shot were complex. Sarah calculated ballistic drop, wind drift at multiple altitudes, and the effects of atmospheric pressure and temperature on her ammunition's performance. All of these factors had to be integrated into a single aiming solution. As she settled into her final shooting position, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The morning's mockery seemed like ancient history, replaced by respectful silence from competitors and spectators who recognized they were witnessing something exceptional. Her breathing slowed and deepened as she applied the shooting fundamentals that had been drilled into her through thousands of practice rounds. The trigger pressure built gradually, smoothly, until the shot broke with perfect surprise. The bullet's flight time at 1,000 yards was long enough for doubt to creep in. Sarah watched through her scope, unable to see the bullet's path, but hoping that her calculations and technique had been sufficient for the extreme challenge. The wait seemed endless, but eventually a faint ping reached the firing line, so distant that it was barely audible. The crowd erupted in cheers as the impossible shot was confirmed successful. Sarah had achieved perfect accuracy on all 6 targets, completing the championship stage with a flawless performance that would be difficult for any competitor to match. More importantly, she had demonstrated that skill and determination could overcome equipment limitations that seemed insurmountable. As she secured her rifle and stepped back from the firing line, the crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Competitors who had dismissed her that morning were now applauding enthusiastically, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly remarkable. Chief Range Officer Bradley approached with obvious amazement. "In 30 years of running competitions, I've never seen a perfect score on this particular stage. That 1,000-yard shot with your equipment. It shouldn't be possible." "Sometimes impossible is just another word for difficult," Sarah replied quietly. The remaining competitors faced the intimidating challenge of matching or exceeding Sarah's performance. Several of the elite shooters who had dominated the morning's conversation now appeared nervous as they prepared for their attempts. Robert Martinez was among the final competitors, carrying his expensive custom rifle with obvious confidence, but also evident pressure. When his turn came, he managed solid hits on the first 5 targets, but struggled with the extreme range challenge that Sarah had mastered. His 1,000-yard attempt missed entirely, resulting in a score that fell short of Sarah's perfect performance, despite his superior equipment and decades of experience. As he walked back from the firing line, Martinez approached Sarah with genuine respect. "I've been humbled today," he said simply. "You've taught me that equipment is only as good as the person using it." The final scores were calculated as the sun began to set over Riverside County Shooting Range, when Chief Range Officer Bradley stepped to the microphone for the awards ceremony. The crowd had grown to include spectators who had heard about the day's remarkable performances. "Ladies and gentlemen, this year's Western States Precision Championship has produced one of the most outstanding individual performances in the history of our competition," Bradley announced. "Our champion not only achieved perfect accuracy under the most demanding conditions, but did so with equipment that demonstrates the true spirit of marksmanship." Sarah Chen walked forward to accept the championship trophy, a 17-year-old girl who had silenced her critics through pure shooting skill and unshakable determination. The crowd's applause was sustained and genuine, recognizing that they had witnessed something that would be remembered for years to come. As she held the trophy, Sarah thought about her father waiting at home, her mother working late to pay bills, and her brother who needed medication they could barely afford. The small scholarship that came with the championship would help, but more importantly, she had proven something to herself about what was possible when determination met opportunity. The trophy presentation was followed by requests for interviews from shooting magazines and equipment manufacturers who suddenly wanted to understand how a homemade rifle had outperformed the most expensive precision equipment available. Sarah answered their questions politely but briefly, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its importance for her future opportunities. Later that evening, as Sarah packed her equipment for the journey home, Janet Wilson approached one final time. "What's next for you?" Janet asked. "With a performance like today's, you could probably get sponsorships, scholarships, maybe even a spot on a national team." Sarah looked at her humble rifle case and thought about the long drive ahead in her aging Honda Civic. "First, I need to get home and help my family. Everything else can wait." As she drove through the night toward Millfield, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The morning had begun with mockery and dismissal, but it had ended with respect earned through performance, rather than promises. She had proven that excellence didn't require expensive equipment or perfect circumstances, only dedication and the willingness to work harder than anyone expected. The trophy sitting on her passenger seat represented more than a shooting competition. Victory. It symbolized the validation of everything her father had taught her about perseverance, everything her circumstances had forced her to learn about resourcefulness, and everything she had discovered about her own capabilities when tested under pressure. Sarah Chen had started the day as an unknown teenager with a homemade rifle. She finished it as a champion who had redefined what was possible when skill met determination. The laughter that had greeted her arrival that morning had been replaced by applause that would echo long after the sun set on Riverside County Shooting Range. Sometimes the strongest statements are made not with words, but with actions that speak louder than any boast or promise ever could. 3 months after her championship victory at Riverside County, Sarah Chen found herself standing in the gleaming offices of Precision Arms Manufacturing, the same company whose representatives had questioned her equipment that memorable morning. The irony wasn't lost on her as she examined the contract spread across the mahogany conference table. The endorsement deal includes a complete rifle package worth $30,000, ammunition sponsorship, and entry fees paid for all. Major competitions, explained Marcus Webb, the company's marketing director. His enthusiasm was palpable as he outlined the benefits. We're talking about making you the face of precision shooting for the next generation. Sarah studied the documents carefully, noting the exclusivity clauses and promotional requirements. The financial terms were more generous than anything her family had ever imagined, representing a life-changing opportunity that could solve their immediate problems and secure her future in competitive shooting. There's just one requirement, Webb continued, his tone shifting slightly. You'd need to retire that homemade rifle and exclusively use our flagship model in all competitions and promotional materials. The conference room fell silent as Sarah considered the implications. Sitting beside her, her father shifted uncomfortably in his borrowed suit, clearly overwhelmed by the corporate environment, but trying to provide moral support for his daughter's decision. Can I have some time to think about this? Sarah asked finally. Webb's smile tightened slightly. Of course, but opportunities like this don't come around often. There are other talented shooters who would jump at this chance. As they drove home in the Honda Civic, which had developed a new rattling sound since their trip to the championship, Sarah's father finally broke the contemplative silence. That's more money than I made in 3 years before the accident, he said quietly. Could pay for Tommy's medication, your college, maybe even get your mother out of that cleaning job. Sarah understood the weight of the decision. The sponsorship represented financial security for her entire family, validation of her abilities, and entry into the elite circles of competitive shooting. Yet something about Webb's requirement troubled her deeply. What do you think I should do, Dad? Her father was quiet for several miles before responding. I think you already know the answer. You've never needed anyone else to tell you what's right. That evening, Sarah sat in the garage workshop where she'd built her rifle, surrounded by the tools and equipment that had made her championship possible. The space was humble compared to the corporate offices she'd visited, but it represented something more valuable than any sponsorship could provide. Her phone had been ringing constantly since news of the sponsorship offer had leaked. Shooting magazines wanted interviews, equipment manufacturers were proposing deals, and college recruiters were discussing scholarship opportunities. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming for someone who preferred action to words. Among the calls was one that stood out from the commercial interests. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the State University's engineering program had reached out about a different kind of opportunity entirely. Your rifle design and manufacturing process demonstrate exceptional engineering intuition, Dr. Morrison had explained during their conversation. We'd like to offer you early admission to our mechanical engineering program with a full scholarship and the opportunity to continue developing precision manufacturing techniques. The academic opportunity appealed to Sarah in ways that commercial endorsements couldn't match. Rather than simply using her skills to promote existing products, she could develop new technologies and push the boundaries of what was possible in precision equipment. Sarah's decision crystallized as she held her handmade rifle, feeling the familiar contours of the stock she'd carved and the smooth action she'd assembled from individual components. This weapon represented more than shooting accuracy. It embodied the principle that excellence could be achieved through understanding, dedication, and craftsmanship rather than simply purchasing superior equipment. The next morning, Sarah called Marcus Webb to decline the sponsorship offer. His disappointment was evident, but he was professional enough to leave the door open for future opportunities. If you change your mind, we'll be here, Webb said. But I have to ask, why would you turn down this kind of opportunity? Because the rifle isn't just equipment to me, Sarah replied. It represents everything I've learned about solving problems with creativity and persistence. Abandoning it would mean abandoning the principles that made the championship possible. Webb was quiet for a moment before responding. That's either very noble or very foolish. I hope you don't regret this decision. Sarah accepted Dr. Morrison's academic offer instead, beginning a new chapter that would allow her to pursue both her education and her competitive shooting goals without compromising her core values. The scholarship covered tuition and living expenses, providing financial relief for her family while allowing her to continue developing her technical skills. Her first semester at the university exceeded all expectations. The engineering coursework challenged her intellectual abilities, while the campus shooting team provided opportunities to compete at the collegiate level. Sarah's unique background and championship credentials made her a valuable addition to a program that had struggled against better-funded rivals. The university's machine shop became Sarah's new workshop, equipped with precision tools that made her high school facilities seem primitive by comparison. Under Dr. Morrison's guidance, she began developing improved rifle designs that incorporated lessons learned from her championship experience. Your intuitive understanding of ballistics and manufacturing tolerances is remarkable, Dr. Morrison observed during one of their design sessions. Most students require years of theoretical study before developing this kind of practical insight. Sarah's reputation grew throughout the competitive shooting community, not just for her championship victory, but for her principled decision to decline commercial sponsorship. Younger shooters began seeking her advice about equipment and technique, drawn to someone who had proven that success didn't require unlimited financial resources. One of these aspiring competitors was Maria Santos, a 15-year-old from a farming family whose circumstances closely paralleled Sarah's own background. Maria had built her own rifle using similar techniques, but lacked the resources to compete at higher levels. I've been saving for 2 years just to afford the entry fee for regional competitions, Maria explained during one of their practice sessions. My rifle works fine, but everyone says I need expensive equipment to compete seriously. Sarah saw herself in Maria's determination and financial constraints. Rather than simply offering advice, she decided to take direct action to help the younger shooter achieve her competitive goals. Equipment doesn't determine outcomes, Sarah told Maria while examining her homemade rifle. Skill and preparation do. Let me show you some modifications that might improve your accuracy without costing anything. Sarah began mentoring Maria and several other young shooters who couldn't afford premium equipment, but possessed the dedication necessary for competitive success. The informal coaching sessions evolved into a structured program that attracted attention from shooting organizations and academic institutions. The mentorship program's success led to an unexpected opportunity when the National Shooting Foundation contacted Sarah about developing a nationwide initiative to support young shooters from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation had been struggling to address the economic barriers that prevented talented individuals from participating in competitive shooting sports. Your story has inspired people throughout the shooting community, explained Foundation Director James Patterson. During their initial meeting, we'd like you to help us create programs that give other young people similar opportunities. The foundation offered Sarah a position developing youth outreach programs while completing her engineering degree. The role would involve designing curricula, selecting equipment, and training instructors to work with economically disadvantaged participants. Sarah accepted the position enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to address systemic problems rather than simply achieving individual success. The work allowed her to combine her technical knowledge with her understanding of the barriers facing young competitors. Her first major project involved designing affordable rifle kits that young shooters could assemble themselves, while learning fundamental manufacturing principles. The kits used simplified components and cost-effective materials without sacrificing the accuracy necessary for competitive shooting. The goal isn't to replace premium equipment, Sarah explained to the Foundation's board of directors. It's to provide entry-level options that allow talented individuals to develop their skills before investing in more expensive gear. The prototype rifles performed remarkably well during initial testing, achieving accuracy levels that surprised even Sarah's supporters. More importantly, the assembly process provided educational value that helped participants understand how their equipment functioned. The success of the rifle kit project led to expanded responsibilities and national recognition for Sarah's innovative approach to youth development. Shooting magazines featured articles about her work, and equipment manufacturers began consulting her about designs that could serve broader market segments. Despite the growing attention and professional opportunities, Sarah maintained her commitment to competitive shooting. She continued using her original handmade rifle in competitions, achieving consistent success against opponents with significantly more expensive equipment. Her most significant competitive victory came at the National Collegiate Championships, where she led her university team to an unexpected victory over traditional powerhouse programs. The championship was particularly meaningful because it validated her decision to pursue education rather than commercial sponsorship. This proves that the best equipment is the equipment you understand completely, Sarah told reporters after the victory ceremony. Success comes from mastering fundamentals, not from purchasing shortcuts. The collegiate championship attracted renewed interest from commercial sponsors, but Sarah had learned to evaluate opportunities based on their alignment with her values rather than their financial terms. She accepted partnerships that supported her educational and mentorship goals, while declining offers that would require compromising her principles. One partnership that particularly excited her involved collaborating with a small manufacturing company to produce limited quantities of her rifle kit designs for retail sale. The arrangement allowed her to maintain design control while making the kits available to young shooters nationwide. "We're not trying to compete with premium manufacturers," Sarah explained in interviews about the partnership. "We're creating an entry point for people who might otherwise never have the opportunity to participate in competitive shooting." The retail success of the rifle kits exceeded all projections, generating enough revenue to expand the Foundation's youth program significantly. Sarah used her portion of the profits to establish a scholarship fund for young shooters pursuing engineering education. As her senior year approached, Sarah faced new decisions about her future direction. Graduate school opportunities included advanced study in ballistics and precision manufacturing, while the Foundation had offered her a full-time position developing national programs. Corporate opportunities had also evolved, with several companies proposing partnerships that would allow her to maintain her principles while accessing resources for larger-scale projects. The offers reflected a growing understanding that Sarah's value extended beyond simple endorsement to genuine innovation and program development. Sarah's final college competition took place at the same Riverside County facility where her championship journey had begun 4 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her as she returned to the range where she'd first faced mockery and emerged victorious. Many of the same competitors who had questioned her equipment that first day were present for the anniversary event. The atmosphere was dramatically different, with Sarah receiving recognition as a respected competitor and innovative contributor to the sport. "It's amazing how much has changed since that first championship," commented Robert Martinez, who had become a genuine friend and supporter over the intervening years. "You've proven that success is about much more than equipment costs." Sarah's performance at the anniversary competition was characteristically excellent, but more importantly, several of her mentorship program participants were competing for the first time at the elite level. Watching their success provided more satisfaction than any individual victory could offer. As the competition concluded and Sarah prepared for graduation, she reflected on the journey that had begun with a homemade rifle and a dream of proving herself against established competitors. The path had led to championship victories, educational opportunities, and the chance to create lasting change in the shooting sports community. Her decision to decline the original sponsorship offer had seemed risky at the time, but it had ultimately opened doors to more meaningful opportunities that aligned with her values and goals. The choice to remain true to her principles had proven more valuable than any financial package could have provided. Sarah Chen graduated summa cum laude with a degree in mechanical engineering and immediate acceptance to a prestigious graduate program specializing in advanced materials and precision manufacturing. Her senior thesis on cost-effective precision rifle design had attracted attention from both academic and commercial audiences. The foundation offered her a permanent position leading their national youth development initiatives, with the resources and authority to expand programs nationwide. The role would allow her to continue competitive shooting while building systems that could help thousands of young people overcome economic barriers to participation. As Sarah stood on the graduation platform, looking out at an audience that included her family, mentorship program participants, and representatives from the shooting sports community, she thought about the morning 4 years earlier when laughter had greeted her arrival at Riverside County Shooting Range. The journey from mockery to recognition to genuine impact had taught her that the most important victories weren't measured in trophies or endorsement contracts, but in the opportunities created for others to discover their own potential. Sarah Chen had proven that excellence didn't require expensive equipment or perfect circumstances. More importantly, she had used that proof to create pathways for others to achieve their own versions of the impossible. The laughter that had once stung had been transformed into applause that would echo through the lives of countless young shooters who would benefit from the programs she had created and the principles she had demonstrated. Sometimes the greatest champions are measured not by what they achieve for themselves, but by what they make possible for others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.